it's Sarah. Welcome back to my channel. And for those of you who are watching for the first time, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be filming the second part of my medical school interviewing video. In the first part, I talked about medical school interviewing in general, kind of talked about the process of getting interview invites, and then also gave some tips and tricks for how best to prepare for your medical school interview. But that was primarily focused on traditional medical school interviews, where you go to the school, you meet with one or two faculty members, and have a fairly long conversation with them about you, your activities, your goals, the whole 9 yards. Some medical schools, however, have recently chosen to shift away from that traditional interviewing format and instead use something called MMIs, or multiple mini interviews. And so today in this video, I'm going to be talking about what MMIs are, and then giving you guys some tips on how best to prepare for them so that you can excel on your interview day. So a lot of students have no idea what an MMI even is. And I'll be honest, when I got my first MMI interview invite, I had no idea what it was either. And so I'll do my best to explain a little bit about what they entail. On the day of your MMI interview, you will have a cohort of fellow applicants who are each assigned a station in a given area. Outside of each station room will be a printed scenario, about 1 to 2 paragraphs. And then there'll be a room with either an interviewer or an actor inside. You will be given about 1 to 2 minutes to read that printed scenario outside of the room. And then after some bell rings, you will enter into the room and have about 5 to 10 minutes to either respond to the scenario you read, to analyze data given in the scenario you read, or maybe to role play with an actor based on content that you read in that scenario. After that, another bell will ring and you'll rotate to the next station. And then the same thing will happen again. You'll read some printed scenario, you'll go into that scenario room, and you will either act out or reply to something you read in the scenario. Medical schools, I would say, have typically between 5 to 10 of those scenarios or stations that you will rotate through. And this can take anywhere between about 60 to 90 minutes, depending on how many scenarios there are. And when a lot of students find out about this, they're like, why don't we just have traditional interviews? I mean, this seems like a lot of work for everyone involved. Wouldn't a normal interview be easier? And there are some reasons why medical schools choose to use this type of interviewing format over a traditional interviewing format. First and foremost is that there's a lot less bias involved in this type of interviewing. Instead of a traditional interview where you have maybe 1 or 2 interviewers who are assessing you, in a lot of MMIs, you might have between 5 to 10 different people interviewing, assessing you, and writing reports on you. So if you mess up in one station and you don't leave the best impression on that interviewer, you have a number of other chances to wipe that slate clean and really leave a good impression. Another benefit of MMI interviews is that they are really testing a lot of the skills that are essential to becoming a proficient doctor. Traditional interviews are just you having a conversation, and sure, while that involves good communication skills and eye contact and an ability to articulate thoughts you have, it doesn't assess a lot of other things that MMIs really are able to assess. Different scenarios have different objectives, but some of these objectives include things like communication skills, teamwork, problem solving, data analysis, and ethical reasoning. These are things that you're going to have to be able to do on a daily basis when you are a physician. And so having an interview format that really lets the interviewer assess these skills that you have is really helpful. However, one disadvantage for MMIs, or at least for applicants, is that there is a lot more preparation time required to ace the MMI interviews. Unlike a traditional interview where if you're a smooth talker, you might be able just to go in the day of the interview with very little prep and excel, MMIs don't work quite like that. If you don't go into an MMI day really prepared, really on top of things, and with a fair amount of knowledge about how to do things, it's not going to go well. You are not going to be able to succeed. And so what I'm now going to do is go into some of the tips that I give my students on how best to prepare for MMIs so that come your interview day, you are as ready as you possibly can be. So tip number 1 is kind of in line with what I just said, which is practice, practice, practice. You've probably done nothing similar to an MMI in your entire life. And if you go into your interview day with no preparation at all, you're honestly going to fall flat on your face. So I recommend that all of my students go online, and look for a large document of a bunch of MMI questions. There are so many PDFs like that out there, and I'm confident you guys will be able to find more than enough. Go through as many of those questions as you possibly can and formulate answers in your head that you would logically give during the day of your MMI. And this even involves timing yourself. Give yourself between that 5 to 10 minute mark so that you are aware of how much time you're going to have to be able to give your answer in and how much talking you're actually going to have to do. And tip number 2 sort of goes along with that, which is look at expert responses. You could print out hundreds and hundreds of lists of MMI questions and go through them all. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going through them the wrong way and you're not giving good answers, practice is not going to be that helpful. And so in the very beginning, and honestly even throughout your practice, make sure that you're referencing expert responses to questions that you're going over. See what the interviewer is actually looking for you to say, and see what are considered right ways or model ways of answering these types of questions. Tip number 3 is learn some content. Now, to be fair, most of these MMI scenarios are designed to assess your skills rather than your knowledge. However, some of the scenarios do cover ethical topics, and it's required that you have some basis of ethics, specifically medical ethics, under your belt so that you can answer these questions properly and with confidence. I recommend you researching and thoroughly understanding 4 different ethical terms. These 4 topics are autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. These sort of underlie all of the ethical prompts that you'll get during MMIs, and it's helpful to incorporate these terms as much as possible into your responses. It shouldn't take you too long to learn them or what they mean, but I think it's time well spent. Some students even like to reference a book called Doing Right by Philip Herbert that really teaches how to think about ethical dilemmas in medicine. I don't think that's necessary, and a lot of my students have done very well in these MMI interviews without using that book or honestly reading any books at all. But if you feel really uncertain about how to approach ethic-based questions, reading that book might make you feel a little more confident going into your MMI interview day. The other content I recommend you learn are Medicare and Medicaid, especially if you're a US-based medical student, and also learn a little bit about how insurance plans work in the US. You should know what the terms HMO and PPO really mean, so if a question brings that sort of thing up, you will feel familiar with those terms and know how best to answer that scenario. Tip number 4 is think before speaking. If it's the interview day and you've just read the scenario, and let's say it's a pretty long scenario, and the buzzer rings and it's time for you to go in the room, don't just rush in that room if you haven't developed your thoughts a little bit, because you're just going to spew nonsense, you're going to ramble on, and you're not going to hit the key points that they're looking for you to hit. It is absolutely okay if you take another 15, 20, or even 30 seconds just to gather your thoughts, organize your thoughts, and be prepared before entering that interview room and starting to talk about the scenario. Tip number 5 is use anecdotes whenever possible. Some of the MMI scenarios will have no relevance to your own life, and obviously you're not going to just put in anecdotes when it doesn't fit. But some of the prompts might be a little more personal and might give you an opportunity to talk about your own experiences when addressing the scenarios. For example, let's say one of the scenarios is about you as a medical student observing a physician doing something inappropriate in the call room. And they might ask how best to deal with that situation. Should you say something? Should you turn a blind eye? And maybe you yourself encountered something like that during your clinical rotations. It would be very appropriate for you to bring up that in scenario during the answering of the question. And that will give the interviewer a chance to learn a little bit more about you and help them see how you respond when faced with different scenarios in your own real life. Tip number 6 is give detailed reasoning for your responses. A lot of students will ask me, here's a scenario, what is the right answer? And the fact of the matter is there are no real right answers for these scenarios. Instead, the job of the interviewer is to assess how you're thinking about them and what sort of thought process you're going through to arrive at the answer that you give. And so don't just give an answer. Rather, give a detailed explanation for why you chose that answer. Walk the interviewer through your thought process, why you did this instead of that, and why you ultimately chose what you chose. Because at the end of the day, it's not really your final answer that matters, but it's the steps that it took you to get to that final answer that they really are assessing. Tip number 7 is roll with the punches. Some of the scenarios and interview stations might be a little jarring. Perhaps the role-playing actor is really abrasive or stubborn, or perhaps some of your interviewers are just quiet and subdued and don't really give you any feedback whatsoever. In those instances, try not to think about how bizarre the situation is or how appropriate or inappropriate your interviewer seems. However, just focus on the fact that a lot of this is all just a setup to throw you off your game and try to disregard how the people around you are acting. Focus on what your scenario asks you to do and try to do that to the best of your ability, regardless of how those around you are responding. Tip number 8 is don't worry too much about time. While it is true that a ringing bell is going to dictate when you move from station to station and when you have to stop reading a scenario, it shouldn't affect too much your actual response times inside the interview room. Yes, be absolutely mindful of how much time is allotted for each room, but don't worry if you finish an interview room early. If you have a minute to spare, don't spend that minute just saying nonsense because you want to fill up time. And then similarly, don't worry too much about the bell ringing before you have finished everything you wanted to say. Maybe it was just a really content-heavy scenario and you're just going really in depth on how you would approach it. While I think it is important to try to gear your response for however long your allotted time in that room is, don't let that dictate everything you say, and don't let it worry you if your timing is a little bit off. At the end of the day, that's not going to matter too much. Instead, what will matter are the things you said or the things you didn't say. Tip number 9 is forget about mistakes you've made. And this is a really tough one. Sometimes students will get through their first 2 stations and feel like they've really nailed it. But then station 3 is an absolute bust. Maybe the bell rang before you had a chance to answer the second half of the scenario's question, or maybe the interviewer just seemed really weird and seemed like they hated everything you were saying. However, it's really important to try to forget about that station once it's over and move on to the next station. Because one of the beautiful things about MMI interviews is that each station is a fresh start. Each station is a new chance for you to make a great impression on that interviewer. And so if you're holding on to the bad stations or holding on to the mistakes you made, you're not going to be able to perform your best on the upcoming stations. Tip number 10 is come up with 3 talking points for each scenario. And this is, I think, a really important tip for being able to talk in a cohesive and organized way once you actually get into that interview room. Let's say the scenario is asking you how you would approach a given dilemma. In your head, before even entering that room, come up with the 3 things you would do in approaching that dilemma. Or let's say this scenario question is asking why you want to be a physician. Think of the 3 main reasons you want to be a physician before going into that room and beginning to answer that question. Tip number 11 is be a human. Don't just enter into these rooms, act very methodical, show no emotion, and leave when finished. Instead, show as much humanity as possible. Smile when walking in the room. Shake hands firmly with your interviewer if appropriate. And try to add some laughter and warmth into the answers that you're giving to these prompts. The fact of the matter is these interviews are only at most 10 minutes each, which means your first impression really matters. So make sure there's warmth and smiles and friendliness in that first impression so that your interviewer has a great impression of you from the get-go. So I'm going to end this video with an example. I'm going to give you guys a sample scenario for an MMI interview station, and then I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks for how best to approach that sample scenario. So I'm going to start by reading the scenario to you. A coworker shows you the Rate My Doctor website, where many of your patients have anonymously complained about your apparent lack of concern about their health and the high cost of your services. What would you do? Now, this is a prompt that you so easily could see during an MMI scenario, and it's one that we'll now break down, and I'll talk about different tips to actually approach a prompt like this. So tip number 1 for approaching this prompt is consider more information. For ethical questions in particular, the writers love to leave out a lot of information that could really help you answer the question. And so what I like to do is make some assumptions and then give conditional responses based off of those assumptions. So I might then, considering that advice, read through the prompt and consider different options in my answer. So I might say something along the lines of, all right, so I would first go on the Rate My Doctor website and see how many complaints there really were. Let's say only 3 patients gave me a poor rating, while the majority of the patients gave me a fairly high rating. And so if I only saw a few of my many patients actually rating me poorly, I would try really hard not to overreact and instead just make a mental note of a few things I could change based on those responses. But let's say, on the other hand, that I go through the responses and there are a lot of pretty negative reviews. However, let's say a majority of those negative reviews have nothing to do with my performance as a physician, but rather have to do with long wait times in my office and, a high financial burden for coming and seeing me. In that case, I would then talk with my office staff and see how we could rearrange things to reduce wait times, and I would speak to my patients about any financial concerns they have and ways that my office could potentially alleviate those concerns. That is taking the information given in the scenario and thinking about it a bit further and making some assumptions and answering conditionally based on those assumptions. I think that's a really smart way to handle ethical prompts because it shows that you've really thought out that ethical concern instead of replying solely to the information presented in the prompt. The second tip in analyzing different MMI prompts is learning to prioritize correctly. Someone may read that prompt I gave you as a sample and focus primarily on the fact that doctor rating websites are bull. There is no substantiation to listening to ratings from doctor rating websites. But the fact of the matter is that's not really the question that they're getting at here. That's really not what they're trying to prioritize. Instead, they're thinking about how you as a physician might react to other people having a poor opinion of who you are. And how, if you're going to overreact or underreact, and how you will approach those concerns and work effectively to fix them. This is not about assessing doctor rating websites, which have their own flaws, absolutely, but it's important you prioritize the proper things in the prompt that they're really getting at. The third tip of answering MMI prompts is be as objective and non-judgmental as possible. To be fair, the sample prompt I gave doesn't really have much opportunity to be objective or non-judgmental. It's a pretty straightforward prompt. However, there are prompts where you may be asked to evaluate, let's say, whether you would give a transplanted liver to a 65-year-old war veteran or a 19-year-old intravenous drug user who's homeless. And it's really important that when answering these ethical questions that do have the opportunity for you to be a little judgmental, that you refrain from being so and instead approach each question as objectively as possible. Because when you're actually a practicing physician, that objectivity is going to be incredibly important to ensure that you're treating your patients fairly. And then my final tip for answering MMI prompts is be as specific as possible. A lot of students think that if they give very vague answers to prompts, no one's going to get angry. No one's going to be like, oh, you chose wrong, or oh, I don't like how you viewed this problem. But actually, the opposite is true. Most interviewers are looking for you to be firm on the decision that you make in a given prompt. It's not about if that decision is right or wrong, but it's rather that you're able to come up with a specific and direct answer to what is being asked. So avoid vagueness, avoid wavering in what you choose. Rather, come up with your answer, say it confidently, and say it firmly. And so those are the tips I have, both for answering MMI prompts specifically, as well as approaching your MMI interview day more broadly. I hope this was helpful for you guys. Listen, I know how stressful and overwhelming it can be to enter into an MMI interview day. There is a lot going on, and there can be a lot of unexpected parts of the day. However, I think if you arm yourself properly by preparing as much as you can, learning what information you need to learn, and really knowing how to approach MMI question prompts, you guys will do a great job. But if you guys have any more questions about MMI interviews or really just medical school interviews in general, either comment on this video or send me an email. My email's in the description box. If you learned anything at all from this video, please do hit that like button and subscribe to my channel to learn more tips and tricks for the medical school application process. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.